on the value. So the value for this round should be which team best solves for the effects of climate change. There are 3 reasons why climate change should be prioritized first. First, it's coming right now. According to the IPCC, we only have until 2030 to solve for climate change, which is less than 8 years before it's completely irreversible. The time to act is now. Coming up with other strategies, such as like implementing plans 5 years from now, is going to take too long to set up and enact. Therefore, we must do action right now. Second of all, resource wars. Climate change has a threat multiplier effect, adding to already stressed society tensions. For example, climate change causes fluctuations in temperature and flooding, which takes away access to resources, especially for developing countries. This causes resource wars. Look to how in the Sahel, droughts have led to deadly fighting over resources in arid regions south of the Sahara. The third reason is extinction impacts. Climate change impacts everyone, from people to animals and biodiversity, which means that because it has the biggest impact, we should be prioritizing it in the status quo. All other impacts pale in comparison. I'll take your PY.
Sure. If there's other things that cause extinction in a shorter amount of time, should we prioritize those before tackling climate change?
Yes, but there aren't anything that tackles it quicker, and climate change has a bigger impact either way. Cool. On to the first advantage. Resistance is not enough. The first uniqueness point is that resistance has failed. We've been resisting companies' environmentally unfriendly practices for nearly a decade, but nothing has changed. Massive companies still use non-renewable energy. In 2018, we can see that 89% of the global CO2 emissions came from fossil fuels and industry. The second point here is that there is governmental inaction. The Paris climate accords have done nothing to stop companies from continuing to use non-renewable energy. Every one of the world's leading economies in the Paris climate accords failed to meet commitments that they made in the landmark Paris Agreement to stave off climate catastrophe. Basically meaning this is just word of mouth by politicians to try and say that they were going to stop climate change, whereas they do nothing. The third uniqueness point is that economics drives climate change. Companies need money in order to continue their practices. Taking out the main source of income is the only way to incentivize them to change their practices. If their only motive is to make money, we need to destroy their source of revenue. Onto the links. Why does Ecotage work? The first is property damage. Ecotage is effective because it targets what companies care about the most: money. Property damage causes millions of dollars to recover from and stunts the ability of these companies to continue their environmentally harmful practices. This means that we have 2 impacts. First, in the short term, we're able to stop them from having to continue these operations. If you shut down the operations of a power plant, then they can no longer use that power plant. And second of all, it causes them to lose a bunch of money, which means they cannot operate other power plants as well, and they're going to be more likely to shut down their operations in total. The second reason that the second link is that there's an example, for example, examples of Ecotage working in the past. In 2003, the Earth Liberation Front, or the ELF, attacked several car dealerships in LA, which had low fuel efficiency and caused a lot of climate change. This destroyed a warehouse and vandalized 100 cars, causing in excess of $1 million in damages. Most of them SUVs or Hummers, which were targeted for the low fuel efficiency. These are examples of Ecotage causing company damage and causing them millions of dollars to be lost, which is exactly why this Ecotage leads to companies not having the money to keep up their practices. They would have to rebuild their entire car dealership. They have to rebuild the entire warehouses, which cost money and time to deliver, which means that we are the only ones who solve for actually shutting down the operations. Whereas if we the minute that we allow these operations to continue in the status quo, that means every day it makes climate change worse. The impacts here are that we are the only ones getting real solvency for climate change. Again, to our weighing mechanism, we kind of we just linked into that from there. On to the second advantage, which is governmental action. The overview here: government action is needed to mitigate climate change, but the only way they will take notice is extremist measures. I'm pretty sure everybody in this round knows that the government has literally done nothing to solve climate change. Whatever they're doing is clearly not working. So we need to take a step forward. We need to we need to do something radical in order to get their attention. Couple warrants under this point. First, although governments obviously won't admit it, research has shown that they do yield to terrorist demands. Between 1980 and 2003, half of all suicide terrorism campaigns were closely followed by substantial concessions from the target government. This means that not only the United States, but governments all around the world, because the resolution doesn't specify, well, if they increase their usage of Ecotage, especially for governments who don't have as much money to keep up with these, keep supporting these fossil fuel companies, they're obviously going to listen to these activists. But second of all, publicity solves. Research on eco-terrorist tactics has emphasized how well-designed and well-publicized acts of Ecotage that might galvanize public support if the public endorses the group's goals and isn't repulsed by its tactics. So clearly we can see that when someone creates a big event like that, there's going to be obviously more media attention on a huge bombing of a building, rather than a couple protesters protesting climate change, just like they've been doing for the past 10 years without any success. So we can see the time is now. Third is collectivism. The point here is that, extending on the previous point, now more than ever, a majority of US voters, especially young people, believe in the need for climate action. At least 1 in 3 US voters in 2020 supported the need to take action on climate change and believe that the government wasn't doing enough about it. More and more people are additionally joining protests for climate change action, which means that they're more likely to support movements such as Ecotage. Obviously, not everyone's going to support these movements, not everyone's going to support the tactics, but at least they support the motivations behind it, rather than supporting the motivations of fossil fuel companies to make money. Onto the links. First is that media attention leads to government action. Look to how the BLM protests in the past few years caused local, state, and even government national attention. Those ones were for the majority of the part peaceful, but imagine how much more impactful they would be if they weren't peaceful. Exactly, that's how we were going to get government attention. That's how we're going to get government action, to get them to like actually take notice, to notice that this is like this is an issue that people see like or feel strongly about in the status quo. Second is that there are better alternatives. The 62% of renewable energies are cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. With viable alternatives in reach, governments and private companies might concede to a policy change as the least costly strategy rather than having to spend time and money to fighting these terrorist groups. I'll take it at the end of this contention. Basically, the argument that is being made here is that right now the government is supporting these fossil fuel companies and oil companies as they have been doing for decades because, frankly, it would be too much money to switch over. But the thing is, when these climate change groups or when these eco-terrorists bomb, they ruin the money, they ruin the financial supply to the climate change causing companies. They cause the government to not want to support them as well. The government is more likely to do what it's been wanting to do but doesn't have the money for, which is support these climate change groups. Onto the internal links, we can see that one, governments are going to take more policy actions because of these two reasons. They're going to be regulating companies, shutting down operations, investing more into renewables. Any one of those things could cause a decrease in climate change, thus meaning that our impact is that we are the ones solving better for climate change. All right, I'll take your POI.
Sure, you say that companies are inherently profit motivated and then say that renewables are cheaper. Why does that mean that the status quo isn't enough for companies to transition to renewables?
Because they like making money off of the renewables, and obviously if the renewables are cheaper, then they're going to want to sell like they're going to want to make more money selling the oil and like gas, like those kind of things, which is also why like right now renewables aren't the main source of energy for like most US household owners. So because there's like not a shift to renewables, the climate change, like the companies, they still want to buy, or they still want to like extract oil and gas so they can get the money from it.
Cool. Everyone ready for the first op speech? Okay, give me a second to just get my timer. Okay. Order will be 1, 2, 5 off, and then case starting in the order that the advantages were read. Maybe brief overview on framing. Everyone good? Okay, cool. Starting on my first word. The first off is going to be the interpretation. Affirmative debaters must delineate exactly how much significantly increase of Ecotage entails in the 1AC. The violation is that they literally don't. Negate is going to be 1 is shiftiness. They can redefine how much Ecotage the 1AC defense in later speeches was deck strategy and allows them to wriggle out of negative positions, which strips the negative specific e-contest as picks and case answers. They will always win on specificity weighing. If we read an e-contest that they're just going to say that they aren't increasing Ecotage to that point, which lets them moot out of all of our offense. POIs can't resolve this because the A point is going to be that it's not flowed, but the B point is that they can just choose not to take POIs. And also the spectral isn't regressive. It determines what the affirmative implants and who it affects, which means that now this isn't just about a value resolution. We say that in order for us to even engage in the round, this is a prerequisite, which means that voters are going to be 1, fairness. Fairness is a voter debate is a competitive activity, and the judge is voting for the better debater, which necessitates fairness in the round. Education is a voter because it's a pedagogical intent of the debate space. It brings portable real-world skills. It's why schools fund debate. TVs drop the debater. The A point is that the only way to deter future abuse. The B point is that it's the only logical route since the judge has to drop the entire advocacy. Competing interrupts on T. The A point is that it's illogical because you can't have reasonable T interpretations insofar as the AF can't be 75% topical, but the B point is that it invites arbitrary judge intervention. The no RVS. A point is that you don't get a cookie for being topical. The B point is that it prevents theory debating. The next off is a poverty dissent. The uniqueness is that the A point is that small businesses are hanging on by a thread. They're suffering after COVID-19. Bankruptcy rates are at an all-time high. We see small businesses are hanging on. The B point is that the Federal Bureau said in 2008 that there was more than $110 million in business losses due to Ecotage, and this is just on small-scale instances, which means that if you allowed this to be a larger scale, there's going to be more small businesses lost. The link is going to be the 1 point is that it destroys businesses of individuals who are the victims of eco-terrorism, but also the B point is that climate activists and harm just the small business owners rather than tackling the root cause of the problem. You can't just expect to spray paint or damage a truck for large oil polluters and expect them to change. If anything, all you're going to be doing is stigmatizing the cause. But the C point is that there's no bright line between what is ecologically harmful and not what small business owners are doing, which means that immigrants who don't have like specific education on climate change, which are going to be bear the brunt of it. Look to the fact that their 1AC literally defends attacking car dealerships instead of like looking to oil polluters, which means that they can literally attack anyone and anything. There's no bright line for this. The D point is going to be racism because of the lack of a bright line, which white supremacist groups can just deck small black businesses or destroy back homes in the guise of Ecotage and saying that they're doing it for the environment. But this is an independent voter because the app directly perpetuates material violence against Black Americans. We see that the impacts of 1 point is going to be that it exacerbates poverty. People losing their businesses are more likely to fall into poverty. But the second impact is going to be terrorism. We see that widespread loss of income leads to more likely to fall into right extremist groups or extremist groups in general, which historically don't actually advocate for climate change, which means that they're usually climate denialists, which exacerbates their own climate change arguments. But also we say terrorism causes extinction because right now terrorists are getting access to weapons of mass destruction. But the B point is that the AF directly increases the prevalence of terrorism because they're now like destigmatizing terrorism, and they're going to make it seem like it's some sort of heroic thing which increases terrorism. Next off is the climate change dissent. The 8 point is that Ecotage is a type of eco-terrorism which stigmatizes the movement of climate change. 8 point is BLM protests after some arsonists are burning down or looting the Target and Walmart. News media and social media use this as an excuse for why the movement should not be supported. It led to the rise of All Lives Matter, painting the movement as violent and ineffective, which stigmatized the movement and decreased support. The B point is delegitimization. Eco-terrorism efforts antagonize the public and media and lead to climate change efforts to be stalled and stigmatized, which actually harms climate change action. They say there's a bright line. Well, we say that once the AF pushes this out and allows people to significantly increase their use of literal terrorism, they're going to stigmatize the cause, and people are not going to be willing to look towards climate change.
No, I don't, but I'm just gonna...
Do you want
to get money to rebuild?
Yes,
rebuilding like businesses that were burned down, more businesses
Where the
coming back,
but
worse
we
for
have Peter and
climate
Mindy.
change. Like things like people are going to be feeling bad for like things like small large companies that are going to be starting like GoFundMe.
I can help you.
Like that,
Table.
which built up businesses, which also allows them to get more publicity, which means that now people are going to probably consume more. The point is going to be arson, burning down buildings, etc. Leads to carbon emissions. Remember that the 1AC provides no bright line for what eco-terrorism looks like, which means arson is still going to be an impact. We see that actually exacerbates climate change. If they say that we're on the brink, we say that they make it worse. The impact is you can extend all of our their own analysis about why climate change leads to extinction. We say like ocean acidification and things like that, which lead to extinction. The next off is eco-terrorism. The uniqueness is that there's no bright line for what it means to work under climate change action. This means that currently any terrorist groups or insurrection groups can emerge and sabotage anything that they want or any private property with no repercussions. The link is that the AF allows people to destroy whatever they want, but also empowers current terrorist groups. They will just adapt climate change as their cause and use it as an excuse for terrorism, domestic bombings. They literally condone bombings in the 1AC. There is no bright line. They can do whatever they want, even if the resolution says there's no intent to harm. The fact is that every time you bomb something, there's no way that there's not going to be damage on specific groups of people, which means that there's no bright line. That too, the fact that the government isn't regulating this and the fact that this isn't some sort of policy that they're implementing means that it's just going to be deregulated acts of independent terrorism. The second point is going to be that terrorism leads to social unrest and that leads to extinction. Extend all of the warrants for why terrorism leads to extinction. The next off is a counterplan. The United States federal government should pass a policy that bans the selling, trade, and usage of hydrofluorocarbons. The net benefit is that the proposed regulations to curb harmful air pollutants have already been proposed, like the Virginia plan in 2019 announced plans to limit methane leaks from natural gas infrastructure and landfills, and Connecticut, Maryland, and New York plan to propose regulations in 2019 that prohibit the use of hydrofluorocarbons, and it's going to be enacted in 2022. And we say that hydrofluorocarbons are one of the greatest contributors to climate change, which solves back for a lot of their brink arguments, but also the CP doesn't link into the disheads while the AF does on the AF. Starting off on the framing of the debate, remember the arguments they make about what climate change comes first. They concede that extinction comes first, which means you shouldn't just prioritize climate change. They concede in the POI that extinction matters as well, which means if we have access to any other extinction scenario and we win on time frame, that means that we should vote negative on the arguments on the first advantage. They say that non-renewable energy is like at an all-time non-renewable energy is failing and that resistance doesn't do anything. And they give examples of the Paris Climate Accords. A few responses. First, Biden's infrastructure bill is massive renewable spending, which solves the entirety of the affirmative. It's a non-unique impact. The Biden's infrastructure bill is like billions of dollars of more renewable spending, which means that we're actually going to be seeing a transition without doing the AF. The second argument is going to be that the Ukraine crisis is forcing the world to shift away from oil. Look to the fact that Russia was one of the world's like largest oil producers, and now that we're having sanctions on Russia, almost every country is being forced to shift to renewables, which is the kickstart that we need. Which means that we can make it before the bright line. But then they make arguments about why the links work, why how it targets money in the millions of dollars. Remember that they don't just specify that they're targeting large corporations. There's no warrant here. But secondly, that they don't give you arguments as to why it's actually going to cause millions of dollars in damage. I contend that eco-terrorism could be like small acts of literally just like burning down a truck, that there's no warrant for why it's going to be large scale. We say that you stigmatize the movement, which actually decreases the chances of more people joining in, which means this isn't going to be just some sort of large movement, but rather it's going to be small acts of terrorism that just build up and strengthen terrorist groups. Then they say that on their second link, the cause of money is this causes people to lose a bunch of money, and they give examples of car dealership. This literally turns their own arguments. We say that their example of the specific group that they provide is actually decreasing the popularity of the Earth group that they're talking about, insofar as that group is like almost bankrupt right now. This turns why eco-terrorism doesn't solve on advantage too. they talk about government action and extremist measures needed to call for action. There's going to be two warrants here. The first argument is going to be that you actually increase government crackdowns because now you're just going to have the government like crack down on it, but also they're probably going to align more with like oil and gas companies because now they're both being targeted, the government and the specific groups. But the second argument is that you're going to actually increase the chances of terrorism because now other terrorist groups, even if they're not eco-terrorism, are going to see the weakened federal governments, and they're going to see that they can actually increase terrorist attacks. And they say that a majority of U.S. voters believe in climate action. You can turn this argument. You take away any of the support that we have in the status quo and gives the Republicans a reason to use troops and rally up troops and specific liberal voters against climate change. And then they give examples of BLM. Look, you can turn this argument. They don't do anything because we say that for BLM, even an ounce of violence in BLM calls Republicans to disown them, and the entire movement is in shambles right now. But then they say renewables are cheaper. This is a double bind. We say that if renewables are cheaper, why aren't companies switching right now? There's no warrant here. But then if renewables are cheaper, then the AF isn't necessary. They literally hold them to what they're actually saying in the 1AC. If renewables are cheaper, why are we not switching right now? And that means that the 1AC doesn't do anything.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Renee. I'm going to be the second speaker. I'm going to go on the top of case, like value round stuff. Then I'm going to go to the negations case, and then I'll go back to the affirmations case. If everyone is ready, my time of 8 minutes begins now. Judges, let's first look at how this is a value round. Extend that this is a value round so that nothing is actually happening. There's no plan being passed. We have no like reason to be specific in this round, not passing a plan that's like we don't have to specify that, oh, we're doing this much amount of Ecotage, we're doing this much. There is no bright line in a value round, and thus my opponent's counterplan is also going to be falling under this because there's no counterplan in a value round, so you're going to be dropping that automatically. Let's go to their theory shell. They say that their interpretation is how they must delineate how much like Ecotage we're doing. But first, I'm going to argue that our counter interpretation is the affirmation must do this if they ask a POI or if our opponents ask a POI. Thus, the affirmation must not delineate how much on a and then we have a second interpretation, which is that the affirmation must not delineate how much Ecotage that we're increasing the 1AC on a value resolution, because we do not have to specify these kinds of things in a value round. Then secondly, my opponents didn't even try to like ask a POI to like understand our top of case, so obviously you're going to be dropping this entire theory show, so thus we do not violate. And then secondly, we don't violate because we meet our own counter interpretation because we don't delineate how much ourselves, so obviously this entire theory show is going to be dropped. Then also another disadvantage to the interpretation is that it's not a policy resolution, so we don't need to. And finally, let's go to the standards here. They say that POIs can't like do this because they aren't flowed and we can't ask a POI, but we argue that POIs are flowed by our judges and that they would help to clarify things, and we can't get to every single part of the top of case in the round or else we would never get to the point, so we don't need to specify every single thing. And my opponents literally used our POI against us about renewables, so how can they argue that POIs are going to be like useless in this round? Then finally, they say RBI shouldn't be helped by being topical, but we argue that our not allowing us to have RBIs is abusive and encourages frivolous theory. And overall, like our RBI is that my opponents are wasting more time by running the theory shell, and we're also going to be harming education. Let's go to their first disadvantage on poverty. The overview here. Climate change is already causing poverty, so I don't see how we are making it worse in our world. Let's go to their first argument where they tell how small businesses are being like targeted the most. I have one response here is that we do not link, right? We only hurt the big companies. Climate change activists do not care about small businesses who are not putting out millions of tons of CO2. Extend how it's mostly big businesses causing these emissions. We stated that 98% of these companies are the ones who are contributing to the climate change and not these small businesses. They secondly say that we're just stigmatizing the cause of climate change. Our response to this is that climate change is already stigmatized, right? Nothing is happening in the status quo. We can't get any worse than that. Otherwise, the status quo would have been solved for it. They argue that we're going to make climate change like less harder to solve, but climate change is never being solved right now. So at least we're doing something. It is a try or die situation, and you're going to be voting AF on risk of solvency. Then they say that we are attacking anyone. There's no bright line here. There is a bright line. Let's have three responses here. First of all, only climate change activists can do this, not terrorists. Let's look to the resolution here. We're not talking about terrorists. We're talking about climate change activists. And secondly, this is completely hypothetical, right? This is a value round. This is not a plan being passed. I'll take it right at the end. And then thirdly, ending climate change in the long term helps solve for racism, because climate change is what exacerbates all these socioeconomic inequalities in the world, and it causes more racism. I'll take your POI.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So you say that this is a value round, but how do we compare which side does a better job, or like which world is better if we don't actually implement something to figure out what is a better world?
you can compare the status quo, which doesn't have it, in the world, the hypothetical world of the affirmative, which would have it. Let's go to their next response. They say that extremist groups do not advocate for climate change. There's no probability, no warrants of this actually causing. They're just saying that, oh, extremist groups are going to like co-opt this movement, but extinction doesn't matter if there's no reason for this to be caused. And like climate change is going to be solved by climate change activists, not terrorists. Let's go to their other responses. They say that terrorists have access to weapons of mass destruction. That's like saying I'm going to drop my pencil and then a nuclear war is going to happen, where my opponents are completely blowing this out of proportion. Climate change matters because it wins on magnitude, but also on probability and time frame. So we're still going to be impacting the most amount of people. Let's go to their second disadvantage on stigmatizing the movement. Overview. Two observations here. First of all, the movement is already not working. Look to how protests are not working. Like all these protests that we're doing to like try to solve for climate change have not been working. The status quo is not going to be solved. And then secondly, extend how 1/3 of people are supporting climate change right now, or like stopping climate change right now. So the movement is less likely to be stigmatized. And then let's go to their response here. They said like burning Target and Walmart and Black Lives Matter is what led to like stigmatization. It led to the stigmatization of the movement. But people didn't take Black Lives Matter seriously until they had huge protests, right? We need this action in order to make the government do something in order for people to like popularize the movement, right? Even if some people are stigmatizing it, it's still just the status quo. Right? And they say that all lives matter, but it's like saying we shouldn't fight for racism just because white people will get mad. I'll take your POI at the end of this contingent. They say delegitimization is going to occur in our world, but first of all, societal support is already not working because people have been rallying for climate change. Nothing is happening. And secondly, turn this argument against them, because even if people disagree with our actions, we are still spreading awareness, because even bad controversy is still good publicity, right? For every one person who dislikes our method, we'll get new supporters of it. That's going to spread our message. That's better than the status quo, which is literally doing nothing. When they said that arson is going to cause more CO2, a small amount of arson is nothing compared to the millions of tons of CO2 emissions that these companies are putting into the air. And even if it is a small dealership that has like only 100 cars being damaged, those 100 cars are still going to cause more CO2 than that one arson or that one like building being burnt down. And then the second response here is that we're not always using arson, right? The majority of these like tactics are like destroying things, keying cars, taking down things. It's not always arson. And let's talk about how they say that we're empowering the terrorist groups to use it as an excuse. Which terrorist groups, right? They don't give us any warrants. They don't give us any examples here. At least have examples of what type of terrorist groups are going to plot this. They say that the government is going to be regulating our like methods and it's going to be failing. First of all, the Environmental Liberation Front has paid particular attention to non-lethal methods. They genuinely do not want to hurt people. Look how they know the oil and gas moving to kill people are actually leading to like gas leaks and killing like our water supply, leading to more death. And the government is regulating that, but they're not regulating this. So secondly, the impacts are going to be outweighing Henry's climate change is killing more people than the status quo, due to wars, the famine, the drought, etc. And then finally, they aren't killing people because they're attacking property. They have no warrants. So let's go to the counter plan. Their counter plan is to like use this banning hydrofluorocarbons. First of all, there's no solvency. Even if they use fiat, which they can't because it's a policy round, the government is going to be undoing this ban because it's being lobbied by massive groups. We have this warrant that tells you that billions of dollars are being spent by lobbyists to influence the government right now, and they're never going to have solvency in their world because the United States government as an actor is not going to be supporting climate change. They're operating under the status quo. Secondly, you cannot read a counter plan because it's rally round. Thirdly, perm. They have no perm spikes. There's no reason why we can't perm. So obviously we're going to be taking all their solvency here. And then finally, perm double bind. I think their counter plan is strong enough to solve for the disadvantages, or it can't. So it shouldn't be run in the first place. So on the counter plan, overall, we're just going to be winning on the perm. Let's go to the affirmations case here. So their response to our extinction impact is that they concede, which means that they win access to extinction, but they don't actually cause extinction. More on this later. Let's go to the first advantage. They talk about how Biden's infrastructure bill solved for the entirety of the app, but they completely dropped our response that 90% of these companies are actually still contributing to CO2, which means that the renewables are not solving. They say that every country is being forced to shift to renewables, but why didn't a single one of them meet their commitments in 2020 for the Paris Climate Agreement? They just have dropped all responses here. We're going to say that we don't specify that we're specifically targeting big companies, but we are targeting big companies. Otherwise, there's no point here. That is literally what we stated. Then they say that we're turning our case because like Ecotage doesn't work when it's small, but popularity doesn't matter if we don't solve. We don't need a lot of people to join in order for it to work. Finally, some of the second advantage is that the government is going to crack down on us, but the government is not going to crack down on us because the government is obviously still going to be supporting. This is already occurring in the status quo. This is completely non-unique, right? We need something to happen, and it's going to be voting on a risk of solvency. So overall, they said that even an ounce of violence has caused people to dislike Black Lives Matter, but just like in Black Lives Matter is what caused change. We need that controversy in order to generate more popularity. And overall, they're going to be voting on the affirmation. It's really the only side that is actually trying to implement something, trying to do something in our
world. And for those reasons, vote out. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? The order of the speech is going to be T, the 3 disads, and then case in order. We're dropping the counterplay. Okay, 8 minutes. Starting, sorry, my timer. Okay, 8 minutes, starting now. Starting on T, you're going to be extending our interpretation that affirmative debaters must delineate exactly how much of ecotage they want to increase. They make a few responses. First, their counter interpretation about how they must not delineate. They don't give us any backing up ways. Shiftiness. They could redefine how much of exactly they're going to be delineating in future speeches, which means that they could say first they're going to be increasing it by like only one movement, and then increasing it by like another movement later on. And then second of all, they give us like this POI example, but the fact is that they didn't have to accept their POI. Like even if he had asked it, they could have just like declined the POI, which means that this sets a bad norm for debate, because if they don't accept POIs in the future, that means that they still have to specify the 1AC. That's a good norm for debate, because once you specify the 1AC, you're actually setting that standard regardless of whether the other team asks a POI. Then they also say they're going to take POIs at the end of the contention. They never got to my partner's POI at the end of their contention. Okay, then they say that they don't have to specify every single thing. We're not telling them they have to specify every single thing. We're just saying that they have to at least specify what the words of the resolution are, i.e. that they're saying they must increase. This is a crucial integral part of the resolution, which means that they have to at least specify in some sort of way what kind of what they're increasing with the resolution. Then they tell us like on the RBI's point about how they're like we're harming education. No, they don't read a drop the debater, but secondly, they don't get an RBA. It creates a chilling effect. Next would be always disincentivized from reading theory against good theory debaters, which leads to infinite abuse. So it outweighs times U and B. They're illogical. I dare vote for me. Doesn't make any sense. Logic comes first in all arguments, which means there's no sense to make a debate or to be valuable. A theory is not it's not an if. So they get like an impact church, which outweighs all of their arguments. They can generate off and maybe off this to you. But even if it's just a policy around our arguments, or that even if it isn't a policy round, our argument is that you should still specify because it precludes our ability to interact with the affirmative. Okay, on the first is that. On the first decide, you can extend our arguments about small businesses. We tell you that small businesses are hang on by a thread, but the link is that they uniquely harm small business owners because it stigmatizes the causes, and it also leads small business owners to be like uniquely harmed by this, since they're the ones who are the victims, i.e. car dealerships are the ones who are the victims of all these Ecotage issues, which means that insofar as that's true, that means that the impact is more poverty. You're having widespread loss of income, which means that people are more likely to fall into terrorism, but not only that, it also increases the presence of terrorism by making it seem heroic. They make a few responses. First of all, on the links, they tell us that this status quo is already bad, and at least that they're doing anything. They make the try or die argument. But what they can see is that the Ukraine crisis, we're already doing something in status quo because we're already switching to renewables. Which means that insofar as we have 100% strength to link it to the Ukraine example, we tell you that the status quo is doing something. We're having renewables. But second of all, you could turn this because again, they destigmatize the causes. They don't actually respond to that. We tell you that anyone could be a self-proclaimed climate activist, which means that any terrorist could just get which just use this as an excuse to be a terrorist. But secondly, they don't make any arguments about how like it stigmatizes the causes, i.e. the BLM movement. They had like the All Lives Matter movement, which was even worse because it led to people like Republicans, etc., like clapping back, i.e. like the that means that led to even more backlash, which means that this quo is already this quo what this quo solves. Of course. Second of all, they make this quo worse. Okay, also, they can see that like it jails climate activists, so they're forced to go underground or distance themselves from the movement. They like don't let them respond to that in future speeches. Our argument is that because eco-terrorism is illegal, that means that climate activists are going to be jailed for their actions. That means we don't get climate activists, what we actually need. We need climate activists to push governmental legislation, not to be burning down buildings so they could go get arrested. And now we don't have access to climate activists. This is a super key point. But second of all, you can see the racism argument that we tell you that it decks small but black businesses under the guise of eco-terrorism. There's literally no bright line. That's an independent voter. You can extend our impacts about terrorism. Okay, on the second side. On the second, just about climate change, our key argument is that basically after things like the BLM movement, it caused even more backlash, which means that it stigmatized the movement, so now it's less likely to have governmental change. We also extend the GoFundMe example, in which if we have like if it's going to be like so much publicity about this, that means that they're going to have like GoFundMes to build back the businesses, which means that those oil businesses or those eco bad the companies that are bad for the environment are going to build back even stronger insofar as they're going to get widespread support. They're going to get GoFundMes from the alt-right, which means that they're going to be even getting like even more support, which means that they actually make it net worse. Okay, first they tell us that the movement is already not working, but again, they can see that like yes, the movement is already working. You look to Biden's infrastructure bill, spent almost like $500 billion on specifically renewables, which means that we do solve that because the movement is already working. But second of all, the Ukraine crisis, but then they tell us that BLM had huge support. We tell you that BLM had huge support up until it was violent. Like after it was violent, that made it like a bad image for the entire movement, even though there was 1 ounce of violence that led Republicans to build up a new movement. Like the Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter, like was largely effective once it was like solely pushing for legislation. Once it went to burning down targets, etc., and stopped productive. Then they tell us that you could turn it because it's still spreading awareness. They tell us that bad controversy is still good publicity. This is such a bad argument. Controversy literally causes even more backlash. If the entire movement was peaceful, that would mean that we're getting like widespread backlash. You can look to the civil rights movement too. We tell you that peaceful movements are actually like key because instead of causing bad controversy, this causes one, the business owners who are affected to fall into to antagonize climate activists, but second of all, it causes the public to antagonize climate activists since they think they're destroying the economy, and politicians can use this as an excuse to brush it under the table by just saying that these activists are violent, which means that we don't want controversy because controversy causes backlash and bad movements. Okay, then on this arson example, you could have said that we say that they're trying to create billions of dollars in property damage. The first they say that, and then they say that they're causing billions of dollars in terrorism, which means that they do make arson worse, which is why climate change is bad. Okay, now on the third they said about eco-terrorism, you could have said that there's literally no bright line. They condone bombings in the 1AC. You could every time you bomb something, there's no damage on specific people. That means that they deregulate acts of independent terrorism. We tell you terrorism leads to extinction for reasons. They have access to weapons and mass destruction, but also they increase the presence of terrorism, which means that they condone it, and that means that future people can be inspired by terrorism. Insofar as if we're galvanizing the public towards these terrorism acts, that means that there should lead to higher terrorism at this moment. Also, anyone can be a climate activist. You can't just say that you're a climate activist and you can use it for terrorism. You can just say you're a climate activist, but you're not actually a climate activist. Okay, on framing. Okay, on framing, on the value round, they tell us that nothing is actually happening, so we don't need a plan. But first of all, the word says should, which means that it is a policy round because we're saying climate activists should. So you need to compare it with a world without it and a world with it. We say extinction matters the most, which means you should evaluate this round under who causes extinction in the short term the most. Okay, on the first advantage. And values are determined by their impacts. Okay, on the climate change advantage, first of all, you can accept if you think there are two responses about how the status quo does solve, but secondly, we tell you that they're just burning down a truck. Doesn't actually have to be large scale. They can see that small acts of terrorism actually build up. They're not actually causing publicity. They're just causing regular people to antagonize the climate movement, which means they're less likely to abide by regular acts of anti-climate change, which means that they're just more likely to antagonize the climate change movement. Also, you could turn because the Earth Liberation Front, we give you a real example of what the Earth Liberation Front actually decreased popularity. This literally turned the entirety of the advantage. But secondly, that we tell you that we need public support to actually pass legislation. Biden isn't going to pass legislation if he doesn't have public support. Insofar as public support is necessary, we should be antagonizing the public and burning down their trucks, etc. That's why they don't have access to their impacts. Okay. On the second advantage. To publicity, we tell you that a few things. First, they increase cracking down. They increase the chance of terrorism happening in the status quo because they condone terrorism, which means that they actually make it so you could just say you're a climate activist, but you're not actually a climate activist, which means that you're uniquely harming people like Black businesses. But then we turn to this because you take away support we have in the status quo. Insofar as 1 in 3 Americans already support the climate change, but we take away the support that we already have because it gives the public
Sunday, Peter and Minnie are coming for lunch in our backyard. Okay, and then Monday, all your moms are coming. So I would like to make the front of our house look very tidy. And the bathroom. I think we should mop on Sunday, but you can vacuum anyway because the moms will probably come in. And then use the bathrooms and grab the bathroom.
Cool. Order is just gonna be tea and then juice. Okay. Give me 1 second to get my timer out. Okay, cool. We can start on my first word. You can extend our interpretation that affirmative debaters must delineate exactly how much significantly increase means, even if this isn't a policy round. Even if this isn't a policy round, this doesn't matter. We say that this precludes our ability to even engage with the affirmative in the first place, which means even if they're not implementing a policy, we can read T, because we say that you should still tell us what you're actually defending. Look to the fact that they're literally shifting in round. This is a reason why you should drop them. They first tell us that they're going to have millions of dollars of property damage, and then they say make arguments as to why this damage isn't going to be enough, and they make a bunch of arguments as to why they're shifting out of this. They then say that arson isn't going to be one of the things that they defend, or that arson isn't going to be a big deal. But then they don't actually tell us what they're defending, which is why they can shift out of our dissents. Their performance in their entire 1AC is and the 1AR is independent reasons to drop them, because we say that this precludes our ability to engage with the affirmative at all in the first place, which is an independent voter. We give you a bunch of reasons why T outweighs case, which means even if they win any case arguments, we say T comes first, because first we say T is drop the debater. Even if they read a counter interpretation, we say that their counter interpretation is a bad model for debate. You should extend the responses my partner makes. Look to the fact that they can still shift out of positions, but also they concede all of our arguments about why POIs are do not solve, because we say first there aren't flowed, but also they can just choose not to take POIs. Remember that T isn't just about this one round, but also just about norms for debate, which means that even if they would have taken POIs, it's the fact that in future rounds people wouldn't take POIs, which is why debaters should just spec in the 1AC. This is a reason why you should drop them. But on the RVIs debate, they don't give you actual warrants for why they get an RVI. It's not well warranted enough for them to make that argument in the block, so don't let them go for it. First, they concede that they don't get a cookie for being topical, but also they concede that it prevents theory baiting. So even if we don't win T, it doesn't matter, because we say that they don't get an RVI. Like every single argument uses up time, which means that there's no reason as to why T is an independent reason or like an independent time suck on the case. We're going to be going for a bunch of case turns that they basically drop in their last speech. They're not well warranted enough to win. They just say that climate action is good, but insofar as they're stigmatizing the movement, that means that less people are going to support it. Remember, their argument, their thesis that bad publicity is still publicity or still a change, it does not make sense. People need to support the movement and live consciously environmentally friendly ways in order for us to solve bad for climate change. Even if they bring attention to the cause, if they cause people to not believe in climate change, or if they cause people to stigmatize the movement, to hate climate activists, that means that they're not going to solve bad for climate change. This is an argument that we make throughout the debate that goes conceded. It turns the entirety of their advantages, but there's a few more turns that they concede. Remember, even if they're going to come up in their next speech and be like, this isn't a value round and this is a value round and we're not implementing a policy, the way that you decide whether something is a good idea is whether you implement the policy in the first place, which means or whether you decide on a world with it and a world without it. And we say a world with this affirmative is going to be a world with increased terrorism. We're going to give you a bunch of reasons why terrorism outweighs any of their climate change arguments. We say the first point that goes conceded is that anyone can be a self-proclaimed climate activist, and they can also just use this as a guise for terrorism. This emboldens terrorist groups who are now, they say that the government is more likely to listen to terrorist groups. This turns case, because that means that terrorists are now going to be emboldened to be able to do acts of domestic terrorism and try to get away with it. This means that even if climate activists are solving some sort of a marginal offense about climate change, you embolden terrorist groups who are going to bomb and lead to domestic terrorism. We say that terrorists are usually going to use things like arson or bombs, which actually turns any of their climate change arguments, because we say bombs are going to be even worse for climate change because they radiate a bunch of pollution. If we win terrorism, we win the round. But secondly, on their second advantage, they concede all of our arguments about government crackdowns and how now the government and Republicans are going to be more aligned with these oil companies, and now they're going to get an excuse to be aligned with them, which means that now there's never going to be any incentive for climate change. Remember, even if you try to burn down a truck, they are not solving back for the root cause, which is large oil companies. We say that they don't solve this, and in turn, they give Republicans a reason to use troops and rally them up against climate change. Look to their own example of BLM. They don't do anything to solve back for any of these arguments, because look to the fact that even an ounce of violence in BLM led to Republicans disowning the movement, and they have not been able to conduct real policy action after. Media attention doesn't matter if they don't actually get to do anything with that media attention. And there's 3 case turns that go conceded, which means that now there's no bright line for what the 1AC does, which means that there's no solvency.
All right. Okay, this will be the last speech of the debate. Once again, I'm Ria. I'll be the last affirmative speaker. So in this round, my roadmap is going to be overview, framing of the round, theory debate, voters for the AF, non-voters for the neg, and then weighing on both sides. Did everybody get that? I'll signpost as I go along. Cool. All right. With that, My time starts now. Let's start with the overview. 2 observations that you want to make at the end of the day. First, this is a try or die for the affirmative at the point where the negative does absolutely nothing to solve climate change. They can see that at the end of the day, the value of this round is going to be whoever best solves climate change, not extinction, whoever best solves climate change. And because they drop their counterplan, they get absolutely no access to that. Second of all, the biggest thing that you're going to be evaluating this round is on probability. Throughout this debate, my opponents give absolutely zero probability or reasons or warrants as to why terrorism would occur if there were to be supposed climate actions. Remember, eco-terrorism is not something new. It's been going on for 20 years. So why hasn't the government had some, or why haven't other terrorist groups been inspired? Why haven't there been this like huge thing? They have no empirical evidence to prove as to why when we specifically have our supposed if we support this kind of thing happening, then it would significantly cause it to jump up. Now on the theory debate. 3 major things that you need to consider in this round. First of all, this is not a policy resolution. It is a value resolution. The Emma brings up the fact that this is should, but again, remember that this because of the presence of multiple actors in the resolution, it literally cannot be a policy resolution. Otherwise, we would need to solve for what every single actor should be doing. Secondly, we believe that this round would be better if we talked about if you go on the first interpretation about taking POIs. We believe that yes, we would have done the exact same thing your theory shell would have wanted if you just had asked a POI. And no, it's not about other rounds. It's about this specific round. We answered 2 POIs in our very first speech. You knew that we would have answered POI, so why didn't you ask a POI about the specific thing? Judges, if you want to vote for the theory shell, you're just incentivizing a bad model of debate when you know that your opponents will answer POIs, and yet you don't ask them anyway, just because you want to incentivize frivolous theory. That extends to the third thing I want to bring up, which is the RVI. Specifically, our RVI was read that said that you are wasting at a time by reading this theory shell when you could have just asked a POI, which would have taken 30 seconds maximum, which kills education in this round, which means that you just make things worse. Extend that RVIs are bad. We gave a warning which said that this allows teams to read frivolous theory and get away with it. This is a reason why you vote for the why you vote for the affirmative right there. We can win on the theory shell. Now, onto the case. On the voter issues, the major reason that we're winning this round is because they dropped our 2 warrants on why economics drives climate change. So 2 reasons why we're solving the aff and they don't. First is on property damage. They can see that when you do use things such as car dealerships, which bomb car dealerships, which cause millions of dollars in damage, you directly take away the ability of the companies to spend more money on their operations, which means that there is literally no way they can go on causing climate change if they don't have the money to do that. How companies are motivated by money, and if they aren't making money, they aren't going to have these operations. That's one reason we solve climate change. But the second reason is because we work through the government. Remember, we tell you the biggest thing I want you to write write this down is that the government is currently lobbied by big politicians, big climate change companies to not do anything about climate change. This is why you can extend all the points we read about how the climate change accords have done nothing. None of them have met their the claims that they have promised to uphold. None of them have said, oh, we're actually going to be decreasing it. Even Biden's infrastructure bill, it's not going to do enough. Why? Because the government is getting lobbied by these big politicians. Every change we make from this point onwards in the status quo is going to be minimal because the government is just too incentivized by these big politicians to do anything about climate change. In 8 years, will we have solved climate change if the big companies are still in control of the government? The answer is no. The only way that we can change things is if we take away the ability of the companies to do this, to lobby the government, and to create this fossil fuel emissions. So because of this, let's go into the non-voters. Couple things that we want to address here. First, because they dropped the counterplan, they have no solvency for the climate change at all. So you can extend our 3 responses. They say that, oh, you don't solve for climate change, you don't solve for the root of the problem. Well, if you can buy that we solve better because they have absolutely no plan, then you're automatically voting for the aff right there. Secondly, they talk about small business owners and Black businesses. Extend how even if we don't specify specifically who we're bombing, it only makes sense that these climate terrorists are going to be attacking big businesses for 2 reasons. One, remember how 98% of climate change emissions are caused by these big businesses, which means that automatically the only way that a climate activist would be
order.
Yes.
This argument about how climate activists are going to be bombing big businesses for 2 reasons was it brought up in past speeches.
You don't make the distinction between who they're going to be bombing. You just say they're going to be targeting any company. Until now.
Yeah. So sorry, are you? I hear an echo. So basically, we're not saying that we're specifying in our plan that they're going to do this. We're saying that logically speaking, they would bomb big businesses because they're the ones that create climate change, and that was brought up by Renee. So, judge's discretion. Cool. I'm at 3:49. My time continues. Now, the only logical way for climate activists to create change or to stop climate is to go for these big businesses, especially when we tell you small businesses barely create 2% of these emissions. The second reason why is because there's absolutely no examples of when these companies, these climate activists would ever even bomb them in the first place. Look at how the only time that they've ever bombed them is for oil and gas companies. Then the third reason that you're not voting for the negation is on their points about terrorism and public activism. I want to extend the overview that the government is not going to do anything at the end of the day, with or without public support. I told you that these protests have been going on for years and years and years, and it doesn't matter how much public support they get because they're not going to do anything. They say that bombs are going to create worse climate change, but remember, one act of terrorism versus the entire climate change causing extinction is going to like be a lot bigger than the status quo. At the end of the day, terrorism simply isn't going to happen because like they haven't given any specific warrants about like why they would go like bomb us like a place just because yeah, they haven't given any specific warrants. Let's go to like some weighing analysis. So let's do some PMT analysis. First on probability. The affirmative is the only one solving for climate change because there's a 0% solvency in the neg world, where they conclude that the government is biased by lobbyists and the companies who contribute the most aren't targeted. The AF wins on try or die, and even a 1% chance of solvency is better than the status quo, especially when we tell you climate change is 100% probable. Terrorists, you can give it like a 2% probability at best. We have no clue that these terrorists are actually going to happen. Magnitude. We went on magnitude because we target the companies that contribute to 98% of all climate change emissions. And finally, we went on time frame because our opponents can see that we only have 8 years to solve for climate change, which is why our inaction will cause our own extinction. We need to do something, and it needs to happen now. For those reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Good debate.
Great debate, guys.
Good round. Okay. So I think Aaron and I will go ahead and submit our ballots and then come back to you to give our verbal RFD and decision.
Yep.
Awesome. See y'all soon. Oh, hey, actually, sorry, really quick. I have Gov speaking order, but Op, can I get your speaking order really quick just to confirm?
Sure. Ria Jane is the first speaker on. Oh, sorry. My bad. We're okay. Let's
Yeah, sure. So Shruti is the first op speaker, and then Mariam Khan is the second one.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're both done. Aaron, are you? Okay, cool. Do you want to start or should I?
Oh, you can go ahead.
Okay. I ended up voting for the government team based on a few issues, but mainly because of advocacy. Gov basically proposed best solves climate change as the value. Neg never contested that. And then Neg never, Neg provided the CP, but then was forced to drop it. And so I think at the end of the day, what it came down to for me was the fact that Neg really didn't have any advocacy and that we were debating on the value of who best solves climate change. I think there were a few other small points that, AF turns in favor of them, specifically with terrorism. I think Neg, after you represent the status quo, because that's obviously what's going to happen to you once you have no CP, you kind of have to convince me that terrorism is going to become a huge issue in the gov world, and so I wasn't quite convinced of that for a few reasons. First, I think AF brought it up in their second constructive and then really hit it home in their voters, the fact that eco-terrorism has been around forever, or Ecotage specifically has been around forever, and that you haven't seen terrorism grow proportionally with it. And second, that you try to align, white nationalist terrorism with kind of ecological terrorism. And I think that, AF's response wasn't necessarily attractive and that only climate change activists are really participating in Ecotage and that only climate change activists are doing this. But I agree with them and basically thought that, that was right, just looking at the status quo, and thought that that was never really refuted. And in fact, I would personally be more convinced that white nationalist terrorists might have reactionary terrorism rather than align themselves with eco-terrorists, to participate in the in terrorism. And I think you try to convince us here at the end of your second DA that, there's going to be deregulated acts of terrorism, that there's really going to be no consequences for terrorists who are aligning themselves with, Ecotage and eco-terrorism. But, Gov brings up the fact that, eco-terrorism is illegal, and that was never refuted. So I thought that those three things were kind of the nail in the coffin for you convincing me that terrorism was going to be a big problem in the Gov world. So with those two things done in the debate, I kind of didn't have any other choice but to vote for the Gov team. Any questions?
No, I think
I was going to say, so my reasoning is fairly similar. I also similarly sort of ended up not buying the larger terrorism argument for very similar reasons. I think one of the major motivating arguments for my vote for the Gov was that the arguments around in the status quo, the activism isn't sufficient. And so at least with this Ecotage, it might at least either it will change the economic calculus of polluting companies. It will galvanize the public and put direct pressure on the government. And then in response to that, there were these arguments about sort of whether that will stigmatize the movement. And then the way that I saw the BLM example playing out was I think the affirmative was very effective in their sort of counter refutations, where they argued that controversy was in fact central to the success of BLM. And then the kind of response was like, well, that kind of alienated Republicans, but it's not clear that they were ever in support of BLM. And so, whatever sorts of benefits are gained from the success of that movement, I think flow affirmative in terms of the analogic comparison. And so at the end of the day, I thought that the affirmative was able to both create several sort of internal links between Ecotage and increased governmental action, and they were able to sort of parry the potential reputations around stigmatization. And so I had enough to vote affirmative there.
Just one more thing I wanted to say, because neither of us talked about the theory shell, was that I didn't necessarily buy it as an a priori argument, even if I did think it was legitimate. But I think that Gov really hit it out of the water when they are basically talking about how they accepted POIs, and a T-shell was still ran, which I think really did skew the round a little bit, especially considering that, and I'm pretty good with speed, but especially considering that the T-shell was sort of difficult to understand in the beginning, and that when it came down to this argument about specificity and bright lines, I didn't necessarily see a reason for why AF was a moving target, just because I didn't feel like they were trying to be intuitively as a judge. So that was just my note on the T-shell. But it was a great round. You both are great debaters, really structured. It was easy to watch and follow.
Yeah, it was, I think, really impressive in terms of the amount of arguments that were covered and really well by both sides. So it was a great debate.
Thank you so much for judging. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Thank you
Good
both for
luck.
judging. Good luck. Bye all.